Hello, Kootenai County. This is Teresa Roth. I'm normally associated with Stop Smart Cities, Idaho, and I usually look at things like traffic management centers and license plate readers, cell phone towers, things like that. But today we're going to look at election fraud. I did not intend to focus on election fraud. It's not really one of my main interests. However, in the most recent election, I was following some of the elections, not all of them, and just looked at the data before I went to bed. And as soon as I did the first reports, I saw irregularities that concerned me. When I got up the next day to check the data, I saw very alarming problems, which to me were very strong signs of not just absentee fraud, which everybody expects, but machine fraud. So I spent about almost a week really digging into the data and downloading everything I could from the computer. And I wrote up reports and gave them to the commissioners and so forth. But it's a difficult problem because what I'm seeing is mathematical and involved numbers. It's hard for people to really understand what's going, and it's hard for people to understand the nature of the problems. So I made this two set series. This is the first one. This is an overview to kind of give you a idea of the big picture of election fraud and how the whole system operates. And then the second video will go really into the details, into sort of the statistical numbers that are the things that actually prove the fraud. So let's get going. Okay, the first thing I want to do is talk about why machine fraud is so much worse than absentee fraud and is so much more threatening and so much more controversial. Absentee fraud we've been dealing with for years, and we can see it. It's limited to a certain number of ballots. There's obvious problems. There's been suspicious elections. There's all sorts of problems we've seen with absentee ballot, but we can kind of get our head around it. Machine fraud is completely invisible. It happens within the machine. Very likely, I mean, the scanner tabulators are the ones that actually scan the ballots. If you're scanning a ballot and you're faking it, then what you're actually doing is probably creating a fake scanned ballot. So it's not like you can even look at the scanned ballots that are publicly available that have been produced by these machines and see what's going on. The problem is because machine fraud is virtually invisible and that people, regular citizens, do not have access to the physical ballots. They only have access to the scan ballots, and that the tabulation is done from the scan ballots. The extent to which machine fraud could be messing up our elections is unlimited. And worse is that if it is actually proven for this NIC election, which is all I'm really trying to do here, it opens up this huge can of worms, because the system we're using in Kootenai County is pretty much the same system we've been using for 8 to 10 years, was put in place before the current election administrators or county clerk were there. Who knows how much, if we can do it for this election, what other elections have we done it for? So it's a huge can of worms. The good news is, going forward, we can kind of fix these problems once we've exposed them and pointed out that there really is a potential for machine fraud. We can fix them going forward. Going backward and looking into what mischief may have occurred with Kootenai elections in the back is a huge, giant abyss that nobody wants to go to, nobody wants to touch, and I think the election officials know this. They know how bad of a problem it would be if we tried to dig back into what's done in the past. So I want people to think about fixing the problem going forward, because that's a positive problem. If we try too hard to probe the past, we're going to get absolute wall of resistance. So I'm just telling you what to expect. But we do have to face the problem. We've got to fix it going forward. And I do want to say one more thing about my involvement with this issue is that I did recognize immediately when I started looking into it that this was going to be a very, very difficult, very controversial issue. So I tried to handle it as best as I could as a sort of an outsider. I did the research. I wrote up my findings in an official article, which I published for the people, anybody to read, which has been listed the link below. I also wrote a email detailing the problems and linking to the article, but providing the basic information. And I emailed to the clerk, the Board of County Commissioners, and to all of the executive staff of the KCRCC, because I believe they are very, very much responsible for, making sure if they're going to put people up to run for office, I believe KCRCC should take some responsibility for election integrity. And I sent that out to them. Almost nobody got back to me. One person who I knew already from the KCRCC did at least respond. I then attended the canvassing board meeting on November 14th. I gave comment both before and after. Before I made sure the commissioners acknowledged that they had received the information from me, and I requested that they investigate these matters and delay certification. In the next half hour, they did not ask any questions related to these very serious matters of the clerk or election administrators, and then they certified the election without dealing with it. In a way, I'm not really trying to blame the Board of Commissioners. This problem totally preexists everyone involved. This system and the tabulation problem, it's a long-term problem for all of Kootenai County. And I'm not trying to put it in anybody's lap in particular, but I did provide a link to both the article and the canvassing meeting. They're very interesting resources for anybody who wants to investigate. And the other thing, again, before I start explaining anything, is I want to reiterate that the type of fraud we're talking about is electronic and it is invisible. So when I've pointed out problems, people who don't understand how the system works assume that I am accusing the county clerk or the election officials in the county, in the office, of participating in some sort of nefarious activities. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reason machine fraud is so threatening is because it is invisible. It can happen absolutely under the nose of election workers. I believe that in this election, all the election workers worked incredibly hard. I think they all did their jobs exactly like they were supposed to do. And this is not in the lap of local election workers. This type of electronic fraud has to happen among people who understand how the electronic system works. And I think that we're going to be able to figure out how that happened. But I want to say that it wasn't the local election workers who were in any way responsible. In fact, one of the most famous people who's actually in jail for tampering with machines is a county clerk from Mesa County, Colorado, Tina Peters. And what she went to jail for was not for committing the fraud, but for exposing it. She, as a county clerk, had the privilege to be able to go in and download files from the tabulation machines that she was supposedly not legally supposed to access. Those files that she was not supposed to access, she then made public, and they were used to prove that the Dominion voting machine committed machine fraud. Now, instead of being a hero, she went to jail for this. So this is, again, I would love for the election workers and the clerks to be, the absolutely on the ball exposing fraud. But look what happens if you look too deeply into the abyss. It's just not good. Okay, for the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk about how election fraud, especially the machine election fraud, is really organized at the national level, and it is a national disaster. And it started in 2002 after the contested 2000 election with the hanging Chad in Florida. If anybody remembers that was a long time ago. But in 2002, they passed the HAVA, Help America Vote Act, and its purpose was to help replace mechanical voting machines with electronic voting machines. The people who did this knew exactly what they were doing. They were not good people. The fact is, as I've said before and will say again, electronic systems are far, far less secure than mechanical systems or hand counting systems. You can cheat with mechanical systems and hand systems, but it's cumbersome. It has to be done locally. It's impossible to control nationally in a centralized fashion. Mechanical and hand rigging has to be done in a distributed fashion. Electronic fraud can happen in a centralized fashion that is invisible to everybody and all the electronic workers around it. So that's what they wanted to go to. This was the whole purpose of the Help of America Act, was to go to more riggable, more to machines that were more able to cheat invisibly and silently. That was the intention. It's very clear to somebody with an electronics background reading what they were doing that all the systems that they were setting up were exactly what would be needed, so that the measures that were taken to secure the elections would actually enable fraud. And that's because electronics is so riggable at so many levels. So HAVA set up an election assistance committee because in 2002, some of this advanced electronics wasn't even there yet. So the Electronics Assistance Commission was a thing going forward that would certify polling machines, set standards for election security, and also it has dispersed over $1.5 billion in grants to counties throughout the country, including Kootenai County, to upgrade their systems to electronic hackable polling devices. That's what HAVA does, and that's what it was for from the very beginning. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. It basically just lists various types of machine electronic voter fraud. The one we're going to be focusing on, of course, is tabulator fraud. But I just want to point out that tabulator fraud is one of sort of a whole ecosystem of election fraud. The reason to do systematic election fraud is you need so many different types of fraud is because they all work together, they all support each other, and also it's far more undetectable if you sort of combine different types of fraud. For example, in the NIC election, which we're going to talk about, it definitely looks, the absentee ballot look very suspicious, but they always look suspicious. So that's probably, there's some of the fraud done by absentee ballots and some done by tabulator fraud. The tabulator fraud looks suspicious to me, but they did keep it under about 10%, which is way too much tabulator fraud. But it's not like they had tabulator fraud adding 25% or anything like that. So these different types of election fraud, anything electronic voter rolls, electronic poll books, electronic voting machines, electronic tabulators, they're all they all have the ability to commit fraud, and they work together depending on the situation, depending on the election, depending on who's available to cheat. In either small or big cases. In case of very large scale fraud, like you saw in the 2020 election, they really had to use every weapon they had in the book in order to flip the votes enough. And so sort of that's kind of the key. The NIC election, they really needed to flip a lot of votes. They needed at least two different types of fraud, absentee and tabulator, and they had to use both, and that's kind of how they got caught. Okay, so the question is, who exactly is doing the fraud and how's it being done? It absolutely has to be done within the machines themselves. So all these electronic machines and things almost certainly have to have modes within them that allow them to be taken over by people with special flags and special knowledge and special codes and go into cheat mode. But this is very it's kind of frustrating because people talk about, oh, we did a logic category test. Of course, if you are designing electronic voting tabulation machines, of course, you're going to design them to be able to work in a perfect way, in which case they tabulate things correctly. Obviously, that is going to be the default mode that these machines operate in. If there is an option of doing fraud, then somebody with special codes and knowledge of how to set flags is going to have to be operating this machine or somehow have access to them, potentially through, if they can't be accessed through the internet, then potentially through the thumb drives or some other, however the machine's being accessed, that is how they would have to be able to use special codes and knowledge to set the flags. And then the machine is going to go into cheat mode, or and do what it's instructed according to the special flags that have been set by somebody who actually has knowledge of how to use the cheating aspects of the machine. So that's obviously how this electronic fraud is being done. There's some notoriously corrupt electronic voting systems where this has been proven and demonstrated that they're doing this, like Smartmatic, Dominion, and even ERIC, which is supposedly an election security nonprofit. In all these cases, it's been kind of proven that these have nefarious aspects to them. The voting systems used in Idaho are ESS and HART. ESS stands for Electronic Systems and Software. That is the system that is used by Kootenai County. And these systems, all of them, no, the ESS and HART are not notoriously corrupt, but all of them have proprietary software, proprietary operating systems, and what I just discovered this recently is they even have proprietary thumb drives. Why is this important? Well, because like I said, the ESS tabulators are not supposedly connected to the internet. You communicate them by thumb drive, and yet the thumb drives themselves are the proprietary thumb drives that can only be supplied by ESS and can only be accessed by ESS approved people. So okay, for this and the next couple slides, I'm just going to go over the statistical anomalies that absolutely convinced me that we had a problem with tabulator electronic fraud. So you can't really see it in this particular chart because you have to look up close, and this is the big picture, but I'm just going to give you the big picture here. What happens is there's the early ballots are tabulated during the day, and they're available by 8 o'clock. Also, the absentee ballots are tabulated during the day because all of these votes have been taken, well, both the early and the absentee votes are all taken, they're all that voting is done before Election Day. We start off with the early ballots, and those are the ones that show a very, very strong performance for the KCRCC candidates. We always have a very strong bias towards kind of Rhino or Democrat coming in from the absentee, and that's what you're seeing here, this huge drop as the absentee ballots get tabulated. The first reporting wasn't done until midway through the absentee tabulation. That is not what I expected. I expected to see the early ballots and I didn't. And I expected to see the absentee ballots not reported until after they were done. And I saw instead this mid one. That was kind of the thing that made me think the night before, this is kind of weird. But the real giveaway is sort of shown in these lines, that the final results exactly matched the things that were reported at R1 here, which is the very first reporting period. That was just a very frequent coincidence, and I think that really clearly indicates fraud. The second thing, and I'm going to have another slide that kind of shows that a little better because you can't really see it in this thing, is there was a huge difference between the early ballots and the election day. You can't really see because this is added in here. But if the election day ballots had come in at the same levels as the early ballots, then all three of these KCRC candidates would have won pretty handily. Okay, so let's look at closer evidence. I told you that I looked at the way the data was released the night before and it didn't look right to me. I got up the next morning and started to compare results. And this is what set my hair on fire. And made me spend the next week going, what the hell is going on with the elections? The initial results posted here were the first results I ever saw at 11:30 on Tuesday, and these are the final results. In all three of the trustee races, they are within a 1/4%. None of the other races were this close. And in comparing initial and final results. What these things are over here are the comparison between the initial and final results. So this was a huge red flag. Not only is this a wild coincidence, but if you know how electronics works, and if you know if what you were going to do was to program electronic tabulator to cheat, you need to give it information and you need to say, this is what I want you to do. This is the goal. These are the results we want you to have. So again, this machine's not connected to the internet. How do you control, how do you falsify a tabulator? You give it an image of what you want it to produce at the end. So it appears that they stopped counting at the point that that the mix of early and absentee happened to be exactly the results they wanted, took a photograph of this or electronic photograph, fed that back into the tabulator and said, look, you're going to have to count 60,000 more votes. This is what it needs to look like at the end. That's how electronic fraud works. So this was a huge, knowing how, software works and everything, the fact that there was a mirror image of exactly what the final results were was just beyond anything I could possibly believe. Okay, so the second huge red flag regarding the results from the NIC election was the very large difference between the early and election day voting. In essence, the early voting came in at about 60% or 59% in favor of the KCRCC candidates, and the election day voting came in at only about 50%, which is it's about a 9% drop, even more in certain districts. So that is a more, I think that people can see pretty clearly that the first reporting, the final reporting matching, that's suspicious. The early versus the election day bias is more of a kind of mathematical, statistical, geeky thing that's very difficult to explain to people without kind of going into the weeds. So this is one of the topics that really needs to be dealt with close up in this other video I'm going to do. So I just want to kind of introduce the issue and point out that, number one, because the early voting was such a huge percentage of of in-person voting. It was 26. This is just ignoring all absentee voting, by the way, but because it's absentee voting that brought the numbers down. As you can see, KCAC won in person in both early and E-Day. So even with this, what I'm assuming fraud, they weren't able to bring the in-person voting down below 50%. But the point is, statistically speaking, with such a huge sample size of in-person voting being done early, you should have fairly good correlation within a few percentage points. 9 is way out of line, but people can argue and they can make excuses all day. So that's why we sort of have to take it offline. I'm just kind of presenting to you with you now. I think this is a very suspicious result that really needs to get delved into a little bit more in another video. So in this slide, I just kind of want to make a laundry list of the red flags that are specific to the ESS tabulators. And we've already kind of covered some of them when we talked about electronic tabulators or electronic voting machines in general. But there's something that's really a huge problem that it is so obvious to people who see it that it cannot be more incriminating. And that is that the Kootenai County has a policy, a long-standing policy of flying in from Omaha a ESS expert to actually be on site during the tabulation and run the tabulators. I cannot express how potentially corrupting this is. This absolutely has got to stop. When we look at how to fix the problem, this is number one. This is, if you don't suspect fraud, if you don't think that there's any potential for the ESS tabulators to cheat, then you're not going to see how having an expert manager flown in from out of state to run your tabulators could possibly be a problem. But once you recognize that there probably is software in the ESS that allows cheating in elections, you see that having an extra specialist in running your tabulators is absolutely cannot happen. So there's other issues I have with ESS tabulators, but that is absolutely the number one issue. There's other issues we've already talked about: proprietary software, thumb drives, operating systems. Thumb drives are how you communicate with this thing, and the fact that you can only do this with ESS thumb drives kind of means that there could be some very suspicious stuff on these thumb drives that nobody can access. There's also, I've looked at the contracts that the Kootenai counties or other counties have signed with ESS. They make everything. Remember how Tina Peters went to jail for accessing these log files? It is illegal, or at least something that Kootenai County can be sued for, for anybody to actually pass on any of this information to any outside person who could evaluate it. They can't, Jennifer Lott cannot give me a thumb drive and I cannot take it to somebody who can tell me whether or not it's correct. She can't give me the log files. That's all forbidden from contractors. There's other issues, that I won't go into, or I'll go into in a different time. But there's a lot of problems with the ESS contract and what is and isn't legal for the clerk to do, and how their proprietary trade secrets are protected, is very, very suspicious. So there's another question I'm going to have to address. It has come up many times, and the question is basically, why don't you just request a recount to prove that there's been tabulator fraud? Well, for one thing, I have already proven it. It is already proven It doesn't need a recount to prove it. And in fact, a recount is probably going to do more harm than good. Why? Recounts, a recount is not a situation where citizens or concerned citizens are given access to ballots. I can go in this more in another video, but the laws, there's very strict laws regarding the handling of physical ballots, and those laws are supposedly in place for election security, so that nobody can tamper with the ballots. The real reason that those laws are in place are to protect people who are cheating electronically and providing the public with falsified images of the ballots from ever seeing the physical ballots. That's the real reason for these very, very strict laws that are governing any access to the ballots. So a recount is prescribed by law. It has to be conducted according to law, and it is very, very, very limited. In no way is it giving access to the ballots that would be needed to actually prove the machine fraud. And it would be relatively easy for bad actors to rig. Only one observer is allowed, only one race is counted, only a very small number of ballots are allowed to be counted by hand. There's a lot of obstacles. It is not such something that's giving. The correct way is going to be a forensic audit that has to be done with citizens filing a lawsuit. There's no shortcuts. The county clerk can't even give us permission, cannot legally give us permission to have more access to the ballots. She has to follow the law, and the law is very, very, very limited. Intentionally. The law does not want citizens to have access to these ballots, the physical ballots. So in conclusion, we have to sort of talk about two things. One is the way going forward. Can this problem be fixed? Yes. Identifying these problems and fixing them is actually relatively easy. We just need the will, and we need to get the county commissioners and county clerk on board to fix the problems going forward. And that is actually shouldn't even be controversial. What's really controversial is going backwards and proving that this fraud really occurred. I mean, I think it has been proven, but there's people who don't want to recognize it, and they don't want to recognize the implications. The problem with going backwards is that this system we've had in Kootenai County has been in place for at least a decade. What means is, again, this goes back to Aza and Jennifer, who were sort of on the spot. This whole system with the ESS tabulators and the whole system, this way it's worked, has pre-existed them before they ever came on board. They really had no part in it. They did not design the system. And so if you go back 10 years and you wonder, and we've had ESS technicians running our elections for 10 years, wow. That is a huge, huge can of worms. How many of these elections have been fraudulently put people in place who were not really elected? That's what nobody wants to face. That is the absolute, thing nobody wants to do. So we have to, in terms of what can be done going forward, it's easy to fix. Going backwards, you're going to get unbelievable resistance to every single thing you do. So the question is, should the NIC election be overturned? Yes, I think it should, but we can't even talk about that until we fix the election problems. And then we just, the question of what to do about previous potentially fraudulent elections, that's just too big of a issue to even contemplate right now.